time in almost 40 years, a clean sheet new American fighter is being developed right now without the words Lockheed Martin scrolled across the side of its fuselage, with Boeing defeating the stealth fighter powerhouse to secure the Air Force's new air superiority fighter contract, and then the Navy eliminating Lockheed from the running for its own currently uncertain stealth fighter efforts. But the firm behind both the F-22 and F-35 is not going quietly into that good night, and has instead proposed a bridge fighter, something that spans the technological gap between today's most advanced tactical jets and the capabilities brought to bear by this new generation of fighters in the works. In fact, according to Lockheed Martin CEO Jim Taiclet, they believe they can port many of the advanced technologies developed for their sixth-generation fighter effort over to the F-35, making something of a fifth-and-a-half-generation franken-fighter that he says can deliver 80% of a sixth-generation fighter's capabilities for just 50% of the price. But what exactly might such a fighter even look like? Well, fortunately for us, Graham Warwick at Aviation Week recently published an incredible interview with Darold Cummings, the designer of Northrop's legendary YF-23, breaking down a very logical approach to modifying today's F-35 for tomorrow's battlefield, borrowing directly from past Lockheed efforts like the F-16XL and tailless Raptor designs like the X-44 Manta. And the results are, well, pretty promising. So let's go over the analysis work of Warwick and Cummings and inject a little context along the way to help us better understand what this fifth-and-a-half generation F-35 might really look like, what it could be capable of, and whether or not pursuing such an effort would even be worth the price of admission. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. A US Navy F-35C, the carrier-capable version of the stealth fighter, crashed just north of Naval Air Station Lemoore in California earlier this month. Now, the pilot ejected and was unharmed, and an investigation into the incident is already underway. And you guessed it, I've been staying on top of this story with Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by outlets all around the world and then places them all into a single easy-to-read feed that helps me not just stay aware of what's going on, but also to see right through most common forms of modern media bias. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 174 news outlets have already covered this F-35 crash, including 23 left-leaning and 18 right-leaning ones. Now, left-leaning outlets really seem to lean into the common misconception that F-35s crash frequently, with headlines like, "With a fiery disaster in a California field, the F-35 stealth fighter suffers another major crash." Now, it is worth noting that F-35s average fewer crashes per 100,000 flight hours than the F-15, F-16, F-A-18, and the F-22. Now, right-leaning outlets, on the other hand, went with the just-the-facts approach, using headlines like, "US Navy F-35 crashes in California, pilot ejects safely." Ground News also shows you vital information about each outlet along with their headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, their corporate ownership, or even their government affiliations. And I love the Ground News For You tab because it compiles stories that I know will interest me because they're based on topics that I've chosen to stay on top of. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandbox with 2 X's or follow the link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I personally use. Again, that's ground.news/sandbox to get 40% off their Vantage plan that will help you stay on top of things. In March of this year, Boeing was announced the winner of the Air Force's Next Generation Air Dominance contract, beating out Lockheed Martin and winning the right to develop and build America's next stealth air superiority fighter. And for a lot of folks, this announcement came as something of a surprise. You see, Boeing was just coming off a long list of high-profile scandals, and Lockheed Martin holds the distinction of having already fielded the most capable and most advanced stealth fighters that this world has ever seen in the F-22 and F-35. And while they say lightning never strikes the same place twice, just a few weeks later, it did, with the Navy also announcing that Lockheed Martin had been eliminated from the running in their own new stealth fighter competition, commonly known as FAXX. Now that means that in the years ahead, Lockheed Martin will still have plenty of fighter orders to fill with its ongoing F-35 program. But as Boeing pumps out advanced new F-47 stealth fighters and Northrop Grumman continues production on advanced new B-21 stealth bombers, Lockheed's Joint Strike Fighters will no longer be the crown jewels of their respective air forces, as the callous march of time sees today's most advanced tactical aircraft give way to that legacy title. Or, to put it another way, as a new generation of stealth aircraft comes online, the F-35's unmatched combination of stealth, sensor fusion, and onboard computing power will not only be matched, they'll be exceeded. And before you know it, we'll begin to see the F-35 in a similar light to how we think of advanced fourth-generation fighters today. Aircraft that are certainly still capable for a wide variety of operations, but that are ultimately second-string players behind a new starting lineup of advanced tactical and strategic platforms. But this is the company that built America's first jet-powered fighter in the P-80, the fastest crew jet in history in the SR-71, the world's first operational stealth aircraft in the F-117, the world's first stealth fighter in the F-22, and the most widely operated stealth aircraft of all time in the F-35. They have no intention of taking these setbacks lying down. And as we've discussed on this channel before, just about 1 month after Boeing's NGAD contract victory was announced, Lockheed's CEO Jim Taiclet set his new plan into motion, announcing his proposal for a, quote, Ferrari overhaul on the F-35 chassis that would include improved sensors like an advanced new radar and infrared targeting capabilities, improvements to the fighter's stealth delivered via new, quote, techniques, materials, design geometries, and countermeasures, and new long-range weapons tied to those advanced new sensors to ensure this new F-35 can take out its opponents long before they ever have a chance to fire back. I'll quote Taiclet directly now. It's like a NASCAR upgrade, so to speak, where we could take the F-35, apply some of those co-funded technologies, both from NGAD and the F-35 program, and you're gonna have, again, my challenge to my aeronautics team is let's get 80% of 6th-gen capability at half the price. That's something that these are engineers. They wouldn't have agreed to this if they didn't think there was a path to get there. That's something that we're going to go out and do. Now, since then, Taiclet has added to his argument in favor of this new Ferrari F-35 by pointing out that it's likely going to take at least 5 years, but more likely 10, to see the F-47 actually enter service in appreciable numbers. Taiclet believes Lockheed can field its advanced new F-35 much faster than that, with those upgraded F-35s then providing an asymmetric and deterrent advantage over advanced Chinese jets like the most modernized J-20s and the forthcoming J-35, all while also addressing some of the shortcomings F-35s currently would have in a Pacific fight, like their unrefueled range. Now, the per-unit price of the F-47 has yet to be disclosed, but previous estimates presented by Air Force officials have placed it potentially as high as $300 million per airframe, which I know sounds like a fortune, but is actually pretty in keeping with previous top-tier fighter efforts once we've adjusted that cost for inflation. At 50% of that price point, these overhauled F-35s would then probably ring in at around $150 million each, which is about $67 million more dollars than today's F-35A, which rings in at around $83 million. And with that roughly 81% increase in per unit price, would come a dramatic increase in technological complexity and, more importantly, capability. But what might those capabilities actually look like? Well, about 3 months ago, I posted a video breaking down the improvements that I thought were technologically and financially feasible for such an effort, starting with a baseline of the forthcoming Block 4 overhaul and then looking to other programs that could be ported to this new F-35, like the new infrared search and track targeting system and stealth underwing fuel pods being developed for the F-22 Raptor, adding adaptive cycle engines like GE's XA-100, and finally, to a newly reshaped tail, new control surfaces, and even new wing layouts to provide a substantial increase in lift, payload, and range, akin to similar Lockheed programs from the past, like the F-16XL and FB-22. But thanks to Aviation Week's Graham Warwick, you no longer have to settle for my take, and we can instead turn to a real expert, Darold Cummings. Now, for a lot of you out there, that might not be a very familiar name, but if you're a fighter fan of any sort, you will all but certainly recognize his work. Mr. Cummings, who now serves as the president of an aircraft design consulting firm called ForzAero, has made such significant contributions to American aerospace that it can be tough to overstate. During his time as a configuration designer for Boeing and Rockwell prior to the merger, between 1967 and 82, he worked on early stealth efforts, the B-1 bomber, and the groundbreaking Advanced Fighter Technology Integration program that led to now industry standard breakthroughs in automatic terrain-following radar, triple redundant fly-by-wire systems, helmet-cued targeting, and a whole lot more. In the 1990s, Cummings led the development of Boeing's X-40A space maneuver vehicle demonstration aircraft, which, again, you may not be familiar with, but I bet you have heard of the platform Boeing was able to build as a result of his X-40A successes. Today's highly secretive X-37B long-duration spaceplane. But Cummings' most famous and popular work came during his stint at the Northrop Corporation when he served as chief configuration designer for the fan-favorite YF-23. That's correct. He was the designer behind the only fighter in the world to have a really legitimate claim at outperforming the F-22 Raptor. In fact, Cummings' YF-23 design was so forward-leaning that elements of it even appear to be alive and well in Northrop Grumman's recently released render of its 6th-generation FAXX design for the Navy. Suffice to say, there are few people on this planet more qualified to opine on how the F-35 could evolve for the future of warfare than Darold Cummings. And I'm relieved to report that his analysis didn't land all that far off from my own. According to Warwick's reporting, Lockheed's engineering and design team is indeed looking back to the F-16XL effort as a model for potential changes to the F-35. The F-16XL, which flew in 1982, was a modification of the original F-16A, incorporating a stretched fuselage and much larger cranked arrow wings that nearly doubled the fighter's fuel capacity. That combination of added fuel storage and increased lift, provided by an extra 333 square feet of wing area, allowed the F-16XL to carry twice the payload of the original F-16 while flying an incredible 44% farther without any external fuel tanks. And maybe most astonishing of all, the F-16XL could fly a full 300 knots faster, about 345 miles per hour faster than the standard F-16A under afterburner at high altitudes. The F-16XL, which started as little more than an experiment, even went on to compete against the F-15E Strike Eagle for a production contract. But despite the F-16XL's performance, the Strike Eagle was seen as a less risky and less costly modification on an existing airframe. According to Cummings, that's a good start, and I'll quote him now. I believe one way Lockheed Martin can meet its goals is by employing two strategies. One is stretching the airframe to add fuel and improve fineness ratio, as well as adding lifting area with a canard or more wing area. The second is to use thrust vectoring to eliminate the tail. Now, before we go any further, we should take a quick minute to discuss what Cummings means by fineness ratio, because that may not be a common phrase for those of us who don't design fighter jets for a living. In very simple terms, the fineness ratio of an aircraft is the ratio of its fuselage length versus the fuselage's maximum width. Or, in other words, it's a measure of how long and slender or how stubby your fuselage is. A higher fineness ratio or a more slender fuselage can improve supersonic performance, while a lower fineness ratio or a stubbier fuselage can often benefit low-speed maneuverability, as an example. Of course, as in all things aircraft design, there are pros and cons to increasing and to decreasing that fineness ratio. So finding the right balance between high and low fineness ratios for your specific fighter needs is vital. Most modern fighters today land somewhere between a fineness ratio of 9 and 12, with huskier stealth jets like the F-22 and F-35 at the lower end of that spectrum, and fourth-generation hot rods like the F-15 and F-16 boasting fineness ratios that are above 10 and 11, respectively. So the first thing on Cummings' list is to increase that fineness ratio on the F-35. I'll quote him again. The short length of the F-35, combined with the fuselage cross-section necessary to contain weapon bays and landing gear, contribute to a poor fineness ratio. This is the main reason the F-35 cannot supercruise. The F-16XL solved this problem with a 56-inch fuselage stretch. In keeping with that, Cummings' first of three designs, which he's dubbed the F-35EX, calls for stretching the F-35's fuselage by just about 60 inches, bringing the jet's overall length to right about 56.4 feet. According to his math, that would improve the fighter's lift-to-drag ratio in supersonic flight, while also creating additional internal volume to be stuffed with fuel and equipment and ordnance. As Cummings calculates, this change alone would allow for an extra 4,000 pounds of internal fuel storage, and another 1,500 pounds of fuel could be added to the jet using the same form factor as the F-35C's external gun pod, collectively providing 5,500 pounds of added fuel. With the larger F-35C wingspan, that would equate to 7,105 pounds of added fuel over the F-35A, or a roughly 38% increase in internal fuel volume. And even for the Navy's F-35Cs, it would still represent a solid 30% increase in fuel storage. But the more striking difference between the F-35A and Cummings' F-35EX is all about the wings and control surfaces. First, he swaps out the F-35A's 35-foot wingspan in favor of that carrier-capable F-35C's much wider 43-foot wings, but positioned aft on the fuselage to the rear of the aircraft. Further forward, he places a new set of canards for pitch control and to maximize lift. Then, the F-35's incredibly powerful F-135 turbofan engine would be routed through a new multi-axis thrust vectoring nozzle, allowing the outflowing thrust of the engine to be oriented somewhat independent of the aircraft itself. This, along with the canards, would allow for the complete removal of the F-35's existing tail empennage, dramatically increasing the fighter's all-aspect stealth and marking the biggest departure from my own analysis a few months ago, where I suggested that it might be too expensive to re-engineer the F-35 to operate without a traditional tail because it was designed from the onset to fly with one. Now, Cummings calls for using a combination of the asymmetric vectoring exhaust nozzle that you can currently find on the Air Force's AI testbed, the X-62 Vista, and the low observable asymmetric nozzle that saw testing on fourth-generation fighters like the F-16 back in the 90s. which all collectively just means that it would be a very dynamic system that also takes great pains to reduce both radar and infrared detectability. Now, Cummings contends that this design, which leverages as many existing F-35A and C components as possible, would be relatively quick to get into service while still representing a step change in F-35 stealth, range, and payload capabilities. In fact, he even suggests that this F-35EX could serve as a suitable stand-in for the F/A-XX program that's currently on hold, as a 30% increase in fuel stores alone could be enough to extend the F-35C's combat radius out beyond 1,000 miles. But his next two designs are even more aggressive. If the F-35EX is a short-term solution, Cummings sees his next design, the F-35FX, as a mid-term proposal that would be a bit more costly and time-consuming to execute, but would come with a commensurate increase in performance and capability. The F-35FX retains the F-35EX's stretched fuselage, but does away with those canards in favor of leaning into another past Lockheed design known as the X-44 Manta, which was an F-22 Raptor-based tailless fighter concept. Unlike his F-35EX, which would effectively just move its tail's horizontal stabilizers to the front of the jet as canards, the F-35FX would rely purely on a three-dimensional thrust vectoring engine nozzle and an advanced computer fly-by-wire system to provide pitch, roll, and yaw control. Then this upgraded F-35 would also boast a much larger clipped delta wing planeform, providing a huge increase in internal volume for added fuel and larger payloads. According to Cummings' math, this design would allow the fighter to carry a whopping 30,000 pounds of fuel on board, which he undersells as a 50% increase over the F-35A, but by my math, would actually be more like a 62% increase, though maybe he meant the F-35C, which would be just about 50%. Now, this fighter would still retain some distinctly F-35 design cues, like its jet air inlets just forward of the wing roots, the cockpit, and the nose. But the most aggressive overhaul design Cummings proposes, what he calls the F-35GX, would lean even further into a sleek and stealthy new planeform. The F-35GX goes all in on stealth, moving the air intakes to the underside of the airframe while extending the large delta wings all the way up past the cockpit and all the way to the nose, creating a 70-degree chine that's almost reminiscent of Boeing's X-32, or maybe a lot more appropriately, of Cummings' own YF-23 design. As Warwick points out in his article, which again, I really recommend you read in its entirety, I will include a link to it in the description below, the wingtips would also be clipped at a matching 70-degree angle, all with the aft edges, including those on the wing, fairing, and thrust vectoring nozzle, aligned specifically to reduce the aircraft's radar signature. This F-35GX variant would offer the greatest improvements in stealth, range, and payload capacity, though at would likely be pretty significant cost. The F-35's wings and fuselage structure are, to some extent, integrated with one another, meaning a new center wing assembly design, which represents about 25% of the aircraft's entire fuselage, would also be required as a baseline for all three of Cummings' F-35 variants, even the EX that is effectively reusing the F-35C's wings and just moving those horizontal stabilizers forward. And these repositioned elements of the aircraft would also mean big changes in production infrastructure at Lockheed's Marietta, Georgia facility where the center wing assembly is made, at Northrop Grumman's Palmdale, California facility where the center fuselage is constructed, at BAE Systems' Lancashire, UK facility where the aft fuselage and tail is constructed, and at Lockheed Martin's Fort Worth plant responsible for final assembly. So even the most modest of Cummings' designs would still require a sizable investment into production, even after solving any aerodynamic, low observable, or structural challenges prompted by the new designs. And building the F-35FX and GX would then logically represent an even larger departure from those existing production lines. Thus, representing an even bigger cost in terms of money, time, and resources. So how much would it cost, and how long might it take to get one of these heavily modified F-35 designs into service? Well, we're going to have to work with some guesstimations and extrapolations here. Unfortunately, the non-recurring costs of standing up F-35 production have not been overtly identified, and based on contract awards, it would seem that those non-recurring costs have been broken down across production lots, making them easier to stomach, but also harder to divine. In other words, we don't know exactly how much it costs to stand up production on the F-35 because those costs have just been rolled into later purchases. So instead, we can look to the F-35's older sister, the F-22 Raptor, for some pretty loose back-of-the-envelope type figures. F-22 production was halted in 2011 after just 187 Raptors were delivered, and contrary to my long-standing belief, the fighter's tooling was never actually destroyed. Instead, it was all moved into long-term storage at the Sierra Army Depot in Herlong, California, though much of the rest of the fighter's production infrastructure was cannibalized to benefit the F-35 program that was still underway. Then in February of 2017, the U.S. Air Force put together a then classified report into what it would cost to restart Raptor production. And we can use some of their findings to help inform our own cost estimates for changing the F-35's production infrastructure in order to build Cummings' new F-35 designs. Although the goal was just to restart Raptor production, the Air Force report and the RAND report that preceded it both acknowledged that some of the fighter subsystems would still need to be redesigned to suit modern production and operational needs. In particular, the jet's radar, engines, and software suite would all need an overhaul. The Air Force also assumed that there would be at least one more major subsystem that needed design changes that they just couldn't predict yet. So they estimated roughly $1.44 billion in non-recurring or one-time design costs per major subsystem, for a total of $5.8 billion in 2016 money, which at our current rate of inflation would shake out to around $7.91 billion today. Now, chances are good that a Ferrari F-35, like those Cummings has designed, would also leverage a new engine, namely GE's XA100 or Pratt & Whitney's XA101, both of which were designed to fit in the current F-35A and C, but would nonetheless require design work to integrate. Likewise, all three of Cummings' designs would require a massive overhaul of the F-35's flight software, especially the more sophisticated FX and GX designs that omit some control surfaces in favor of more advanced thrust vector control. And while this new F-35 would already boast a new radar thanks to the ongoing Block 4 upgrade, I think it would be safe to say that the extent of the design changes to the aircraft would at least match the cost of simply revamping the F-22's design. Now, once the design's been hashed out, up next would be creating the new tooling, or all the equipment, jigs, fixtures, molds, dies, and templates necessary to mass produce these new fighters. According to the Air Force, the Raptor's original government-furnished equipment tooling cost roughly $1.1 billion to produce back in 1997, or about $2.23 billion today. Then they assumed a fair portion of that tooling would need to be refurbished after being pulled out of storage for an estimated cost of around $228 million, or around $310.89 million in 2025. So with that all in mind, tooling for Cummings' least aggressive changes in the F-35EX would likely land somewhere between those two figures, but maybe closer to the lower one, as it would retain the most F-35A and C components. The more sophisticated F-35FX would probably land somewhere closer to the higher end of that spectrum, and the F-35GX, which departs the most from the original design, could potentially exceed that $1 billion mark for tooling alone. Now, with the tooling complete, the next challenge would be the requalification of subcontractors and vendors who would be tasked with producing entirely new components for this new F-35 design. Now, some of this would be much easier work than with the F-22 years after production had halted, as F-35 suppliers are all probably already complying with federal acquisition regulations, already have existing supply chains, and wouldn't need to start the whole evaluation process over again. But verifying supplier production capabilities, quality management, and certification of new components would 100% still be necessary, and in a lot of cases would probably even require site visits and inspections. The F-22, which had roughly 1,000 subcontractors and vendors involved in its production, was projected to cost about $1.2 billion to complete this process, which is about $1.64 billion today. The F-35 program, on the other hand, has nearly twice as many vendors and subcontractors, around 1,900, and would be undergoing significant changes rather than just coming out of dormancy. So we'll just keep that figure where it is and call that even. And finally, the Air Force anticipated roughly $1.5 billion in general government costs associated with standing production on the F-22 back up, which is about $2.05 billion today. Now, that would include things like staffing, operations, legal reviews, audits, regulatory compliance, support, documentation, technical oversight, logistics, overhead, and everything else you can come up with. And this is where things get a little more complicated. If the plan is to modify existing F-35 production lines to build new F-35EXs instead, for instance, well, this cost would likely be pretty low, as the existing personnel and infrastructure would just be shifting to a new design. But that may not be a very likely possibility. With over 1,100 F-35s already out there in the world and hundreds more on order for foreign partners and allies, there would still be a very strong market demand for that original and cheaper F-35. And that may well require standing up entirely new production lines for the upgraded versions of the jet. So all told, changing F-35 production lines to produce the F-35EX might come with a non-recurring startup cost of maybe around $10.3 billion, while the more advanced F-35FX or GX might come in closer to $12.2 billion. But standing up new production lines for these fighters might actually come out closer to the highest estimates for an F-22 restart at an adjusted $16.36 billion in startup costs alone, before we consider the per-unit cost of building the aircraft. And for that, we can look back to Lockheed Martin CEO Jim Taiclet and his claim that this Ferrari upgraded F-35 would cost about half the price of a sixth-generation fighter, or my estimate of about $150 million apiece. So with these very rough, and I want to emphasize very rough estimates, we can assess that it might cost somewhere between $40 and even $56 billion to purchase 200 upgraded F-35s, which it is worth noting would be enough to buy anywhere from 440 to more than 620 of today's F-35As. Of course, more isn't always the answer. Sometimes better really is better, but it's important that we recognize what an undertaking such a design overhaul really would be, so we can fairly weigh the tactical and strategic value of an upgraded F-35 with better stealth, improved payload, and greater range against what it would cost us to bring it to fruition. But I want to hear what you think. Are Cummings F-35 designs just what America needs to secure its place atop the air power heap for years to come? Or are they really just super cool flights of fancy? Either way, I loved getting this glimpse into the mind of a legendary aircraft designer, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what does ultimately come of Lockheed's Ferrari F-35 pitch. But for now, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandbox News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the Force. If you got anything out of today's video, please make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and I mean it, I'm really trying to hit 500,000 subscribers. And while you're down there, leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandbox News.